G'day, money miners. End of the year is approaching and the recaps are coming in great. And tell you what, this one's a bloody... we've pulled an absolute legend out of the journalism industry.
This is awesome.
It helped that I knew her very well. Jennifer Hewett from the Australian Financial Review, who's had an illustrious career as a columnist in multiple media organisations. Bloody good friend of mine. Like, she's begging me to come on, but I squeezed her in. And it was a... Gee, she knows her shit.
Yeah. Wealth of knowledge. I've got to admit, I was very surprised at your friends after meeting her. Like,
different walks of life. Yeah. Expectations were high, and they were exceeded. It was a cracking chat. So
yeah, so mate, pretty much everything on politics, energy, a lot on energy in Australia, China, Trump,
resource policy, everything. Super fascinating chat.
Oh, I reckon if we kept going, we could have bird her up, like, I reckon, because I know she doesn't step not backwards in coming forward. Got some good opinions. I loved it.
Definitely.
So close to Christmas, but
13 days
not as close to Eneabba, but
yeah,
it's getting closer every day.
Getting closer every day. Can't wait. We're pumped. We're going to go there. Yeah, mate, I'm excited for that. That's going to be a highlight of next year. But yeah, in the interim, I'm going to look forward to listening to Jenni on this, buddy.
One thing we didn't mention in this, I can't believe I completely forgot to even bring it up. Do you remember I was telling you about that famous saying at Daisy Milano, get Saltbush to do it? Okay, I don't know. I'm surprised Jenni didn't mention it.
It's in the folklore there, hey?
I just read, like, if there was the shittest job, even if the dunny was broken, it's like, oh, that's a Saltbush job. Saltbush contracting. That is, they're contractors. They will do anything. No, moving rock from A to B with these beautiful haul trucks I'll show here. Only one aspect. Contractors. They will do anything on your mine site.
Yeah, they'll run through a brick wall for you.
Give yourself an early Christmas present and just have this fleet that I'll bring up right now going across your countryside, moving rock from A to B and making you money via Saltbush contracting.
Could not be easier. Details are in the show notes. Get busy.
Mate,
Merry Christmas.
Mate, when your kids ask you, Dad, Mum, what do you want for Christmas? You just reply and say, I want Saltbush contracting
to do something for me.
Do it for me.
Go Saltbush.
Go Saltbush. I would say one of my best friends, not just because she's from the AFR, my great friend Jenni Hewett, a historical university connection, still talks to me. Welcome to our show, Jenni.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt your holiday.
Well, I know I wasn't expecting any less from you, of course.
Well, after all the years you've been begging me to come on, I thought I'd finally make it.
I do appreciate it. I do appreciate it.
Make it happen for you. So,
Matty, we're returning the favour, mate, because, like, you're bringing her onto our platform, but in the past, Jenni brought you onto the AFR's platform.
No, that was bloody Merce, her daughter, who tricked me into doing an article about my CFD losses. And I'm like, once it come out, I'm like, so am I getting paid for this? She's like, no, it's a great, I've done a lot of attention. I'm like, you stitched me up, Merce.
Yeah, that's right. It just demonstrated how you shouldn't do what you did. I think it was a good lesson for
Still
the world.
doing it. I'm making a bit of money out of them these days.
Oh, don't say that.
Right, so for those who don't know, the great Jennifer Hewett is a columnist for the AFR. God, you've been at the Oz. Let's just say you've been doing it for
I've been doing it for some time.
20 years or so. And I'll get in trouble when I talk about how long you've been writing for, Jenni. But national affairs, you'd say, politics, bit of mining, buddy, just a bit of everything.
Critical minerals, energy, the interplay of all of that. Does that sound
International,
about right?
yeah, everything basically.
Right.
Jack of all trades.
You're warming up all the conferences for me with all the MC roles because once you finish up, Jenni, I'm going to take over.
Oh, don't worry, I'll be recommending you.
Yeah. Right, lads, let's take it away.
Should we start with energy policy? Now, we generally try and steer clear of politics because it can be, you can alienate a good bit of the audience. But I think this conversation is going to veer into it specifically as it relates to commodities. And I think one of the interesting spots to start this one, Jenni, is the nuclear policy. You've written a bit about this over the past year, and it's become a real flashpoint between the coalition and the Labor Party. So from your perspective, you live in Sydney and you write about these topics from a bit of a different lens to what we see here in Perth. But how much of a sort of hot rod is this at the minute, and what sort of role do you think it's going to play over the next year in Australia?
Oh, I think the energy policy is going to be huge, and the reason the energy policy is going to be huge is of course the fact that the energy market at the moment is extremely dysfunctional, showing years and years and years of crazy policies and refusal to accept reality and things. So you've got the coalition's nuclear policy, which I think they're going to announce a few more details quite shortly before Christmas. Possibly this week, I think. But as well as that, you've got the renewables policy, which the federal government has, and that relies obviously on a great expansion of renewables. But what they kind of neglected for some time until reality kind of came and hit them in the head was that you need firming power, whether it's gas, whether it's hydro, whether it's batteries. And basically, they neglected gas. Chris Bowen, the energy minister, could hardly say the word for at least the first year. And then at the same time, you've got state governments like New South Wales and Victoria, particularly Victoria, where they just refuse to acknowledge that they would need gas development as well. So anyway, the result is you've got coal-fired power stations, which are obviously ageing, but also not only that, they're kind of uneconomic to run. And so the investment to even keep them going hasn't been there. And so like a couple of weeks ago, we're in this ludicrous position where the New South Wales Premier is begging citizens to not turn on their dishwashers or air conditioning after 3 o'clock.
Bloody hell.
Shocking for a country like Australia with the abundance that we have, that we kind of get to this point. Do you see a big change in gas? Have we reached that tipping point now, and do you expect the incumbent government to really change their tone coming into an election in the next half year now?
Well, they've changed their tone, but of course, it's not as though you can say, "Oh, look, we've changed our tone on gas, and therefore it'll be all this gas that's suddenly available." I mean, and the other issue is that New South Wales and Victoria state governments have just refused, basically, to extend or allow development of gas for years and years and years. And so therefore there is a kind of a great shortage. So it has, a lot of it comes from Queensland, maybe from South Australia, but it's a very fragile, rickety system. And just because you've changed your tone doesn't mean that there's going to be a sudden, availability, easy supply of gas.
Where are they going to put the plants over there? Are they proposing to put them in anywhere?
Well,
the gas-fired plants?
Well, they've got a couple that are underway, but it won't be nearly enough. And then there's this whole thing about the LNG import terminals,
where you've got Phillip Bay in the middle of
well, of course,
Melbourne.
There's arguments about where they, the environmental arguments about whether this should be allowed. But I think the advanced one, most advanced is Andrew Forrest's at Port Kembla.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. But even then, they still haven't got contracts for a lot of the gas, the Squadron Energy, about long-term contracts. So, I just think it's so uncertain, and it all relies on the fact that everything kind of keeps in balance, and also that if there are kind of hot days or a wind drought or something, that industry winds back dramatically on its use of power, which doesn't seem to be a particularly sensible way to run energy policy. In the 2020s, let's face it.
Not in the biggest city in the country.
No, but also that in terms of nuclear energy, and of course, even at best, what the coalition is talking about is that you're beginning to get nuclear energy possibly in the mid 2030s, not really getting going to the 2040s. Well, our problem is the next decade, particularly.
It's also a change in tone from privatisation of energy in Australia, right, to a stance where these 7 reactors would be built by the government, or at least the government having a significant role, and
government owned. It is a kind of slightly bizarre thing that you've got the coalition saying yes, we'll own all these nuclear power stations. We'll build them and own them. Yeah. That is a very bizarre position.
Will that happen with gas? Do you think?
Well,
if they
I
go
think
ahead
gas.
with
It doesn't have to.
No, it doesn't have to with gas. Not as much, I think, but they've got to have the right settings in place to allow gas to be developed.
We've got tremendous reserves, but the hold up has been permitting these great reserves to actually even come online.
Yeah.
Well, unlike nuclear, there's a skill set.
Yeah, and Victoria in particular has been, like the energy minister, they've been there for a long time, Lily D'Ambrosio, despite the fact it's such a gas-dependent state. I mean, as far as she's concerned, gas is anathema. And of course, the hilarious thing is they're also, talk up their environmental credentials. Well, because they've refused to allow any gas development, what they use instead is brown coal.
Yep.
And, the dirtiest fuel of all. And they've got a couple of secret deals to subsidise the continuation of brown coal because of the state they're in.
Yeah, the enormous Loy Yang got extended, and another one in the Latrobe region there as well. Just on, continuing on coal there for a moment. Over the past couple of years, we saw a massive tick up in the royalties, state-based in Queensland as well as New South Wales. Do you think that's now at a level, and do you think that could be more politicised as a means for paying for this transition again? And that was to the uproar of the mining sector, in particular in Queensland, where groups like BHP said, we're not putting $1 more into this state given what you've done. Do you see that being further used, or have they used that as much as they could?
The state government in Queensland, you've now got a new coalition government there, LNP government rather, and I can't imagine that they're going to increase royalties anymore. I mean, basically it just makes it too difficult.
They won't increase them, but will they reduce them?
I'm not sure they will reduce them, actually. I think in that sense, unless they can get a big thing of investment from someone like BHP, which I'm not sure that will be the case because there's many other issues that would affect the investment model. So I would doubt that, but because they're in such kind of dire financial straits or fiscal straits with their budget.
Their own state situation first.
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you think they're going to be, because uranium mining's the other one in Queensland as well, that I think is the incumbent LNP, are they looking a bit more pro for mining? A bit less red tape maybe?
Well, maybe a bit less red tape. I mean, that's certainly their inclination. Of course, whether or not how that develops is another matter. I mean, you've always got to have, there's so many kind of environmental rules these days. So they'll try that, but without being too radical, because I think that's going to be an issue. But clearly, that's where they'd like to go a bit more.
Yeah. Well, we're just talking to our great friends at AMEC and talk about people that know everything about native title and heritage. And holy snap and duck shit, there is some. Oh, you beat your head against the wall.
Yeah, well,
and I'm not even running the companies.
Well, it's very hard to open a mine anywhere.
Yeah.
But it's other than maybe somewhere in Africa. But it's.
Although it just gets taken off you later on.
Yes, well, that's that. Of course, I mean, but that's a big issue. I mean, but in Australia, it's become more and more difficult to open a mine anywhere, and I don't think that's going to change. And in terms of the delays and everything, and of course, that's one of the things that is always going to be an issue because people suddenly kind of go, "Oh, wow, I think we really need this now," and you're talking 10, 15 years before you begin to see first production at best.
Mm. When the Regis decision come over about Mcphillamys, like obviously we're in the mining state and like it's big news for us and like we talk about it every day. But like in Sydney and Melbourne, like is the general public that aware of what goes on in mining and that sort of stuff specifically, whether it's in New South Wales or not? What's the vibe like over there?
Well, I think for anybody who's in the mining industry in those states, obviously it's huge. But I think it's a very, very different vibe in New South Wales and Victoria. It's it's a bit as like little kids when you get a quart of milk and they think the milk comes from the supermarket. I think a lot of people in New South Wales and Victoria actually forget where things come from.
Yeah.
So I think the Mcphillamys decision was a very big issue for anybody who's interested in mining and understands what's going on, and also for regional areas. But in terms of the city and most people in Sydney and Melbourne, I don't think they would have heard of it or paid much attention. Or to the extent they did, they think, oh well, that's a good idea.
Yeah. What are they interested in mostly over there? Rugby league, poker machines.
I mean, it's the Western world
yeah.
in a microcosm, right?
Yeah.
What's the US opened a few mines in the past few decades, and Europe's barely got an operation, and there's protests in the street when you want to open one lithium mine or something like that. So it's kind of reflective of where we are as a society. So,
Yeah, that's like this kind of gap between what's needed
yeah.
and what people want. And I mean, I did used to think it was kind of quite humorous was when for a couple of years ago, everybody was talking about green metals and people didn't really understand what it meant, but they thought, oh, that's got to do with the energy transition. So therefore that's fine. That's a kind of a different form of mining, as if they'd never seen a lithium mine or something. It was very weird.
Bloody Daysat will find you some of that green metal. If you want to find green metal, if you want to make green metal.
The Geofizz champions.
Oh, well, won't they, mate?
It actually, mate, Geofizz, like there is green on the page when you get the Geofizz data.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
There you go. And you got to, I'm pretty sure Daysat are the only company that are doing Geofizz in the country at the moment.
Yeah.
Word
do
on the
best.
decline. Yeah. Mate. And speaking of Christmas presents, like they've already got 8 gravity crews working in WA at the moment.
8?
They've got an office in the heart of WA, Kalgoorlie.
Impressive.
But mate, if you ring them up and say, heard about your money of mine, they are going to give free mobilisation for any new WA contracts for December, January.
Free.
That is ho, 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 merry Daysat.
Give yourself a Christmas present and call Daysat.
Mate.
Did I see they got 8 gravity crews working in WA? 8.
And mate, they're still giving away shit for free.
That is impressive.
Oh.
Dash, you are the opposite of the Grinch. You are Santa.
Decades of
He's
experience
just
as well.
He's just Santa. He's not one of those drunk Santas that are in the shopping centres, like the legit Santa. But mate, as we said, gravity, magnetics, and that's from ground, drone or helicopter, radiometrics, passive seismic, soil sampling, mate, anything before you want to drill a fucking hole pretty much, Daysat will tell you where to put the hole.
Free mobilisation. What are you waiting for?
Oh, what are you waiting for? Right, let's get back into it. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. What did you heard any feedback of the what was it, the nuclear energy review that just happened in Canberra last week?
Well, of course, the coalition is saying that's a completely biased, political thing because they talked about how much it was going to cost, and they said, renewable energy with firming was still much cheaper than nuclear power, and that may well be the case. But I probably is the case. But I don't think that the government's argument that renewables and is going to be, it's obviously cheaper. Remember, I don't know, you probably don't remember, but in the last election campaign, they were saying, well, of course it's cheaper because, solar, the sun's free, wind's free, your power bills are going to go down. And nobody was actually acknowledging that with the cost of all the transmission and converting solar and wind power is actually incredibly expensive. And so no matter what happens, I don't know how much, but we're all going to be facing much higher power bills. And your only hope is really that there'll be technological advances that'll make batteries kind of somewhat cheaper. Certainly hydropower, I think in Australia, like all the dreams of that, if you just look at Snowy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a disaster, really, in terms of the cost of that. So I feel that
that's the fear with the government.
No,
building anything.
Won't be working for years.
Yeah, right.
And I think it's, the original cost that Malcolm Turnbull put it up was like $2 billion. I mean, it's now
It's at 12, isn't
12
it?
and counting,
Yeah.
and nowhere near finished, and that doesn't include the transmission lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a similar issue to Woodsmith in some ways. The rotating bore header stopped working, the geotech wasn't done properly, and all of a sudden, you can't sink this shaft any further.
We're speaking of sort of capex blowouts and government money. We should talk about Eneabba. So this, popped up in the headlines just earlier this week. Government going from 1.2 and a bit to 1.6, and we'll see if that's a kind of pit stop on the way. What do you kind of make of this and the broader sort of push for these, very specific rare earth investments by the government?
Well, of course, this was the first $1.2 billion came up at the dying days of the Morrison government.
Yep. Week before caretaker period.
Yeah, and so they decided to kind of go ahead with that. And but kind of in a sense, that was all the kind of gung ho. This is our future. We've said, we're no longer going to be reliant on minerals like iron ore or coal. Well, there's a whole new future here in critical minerals and rare earths and things. And I don't think people quite understood how complicated this was. And in a sense, incredibly even more expensive, but without the scale. And but they had them kind of over a barrel, I think, with the government, because they could say, well, we've got the $1.2 billion, we can't actually go any further unless you give us more money. And you've seen that in a few instances. I'm not sure, really how effective that will be. Clearly, there's a whole lot of talk about supply chains and diversifying away from China, and this is an option for Australia, and it's going to be all these kind of great possibilities. But I'm not sure about the economics of any of it really at the moment.
And our unfortunate success in downstream processing of late, it's probably not the best as a country.
Lack of success.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, because it's
I wish it was.
yeah, but
yeah.
again, it was that thing. It's a bit like the whole dream of renewables, but even more complicated because it sounds like a great vision. Oh, we've got all this natural resources here. We'll just kind of make use of them, and it makes more sense. And whether it was Roger Cook or Anthony Albanese, they're talking about, we're going to be this great battery manufacturer, and I don't think anybody had any understanding of how complicated it was, what a protracted process it was, what skills you needed, and also how expensive it would be.
We want to get paid too much in Australia.
Well,
You can't compete.
well, in that sense, it's very, very hard to compete. And the only reason that you could compete if people were willing to pay more and have that kind of premium, and maybe in some cases over time that will happen. But at the moment, there's not much evidence of that.
Isn't that to the extent Australia's been a tremendously rich country over the last couple of decades? It's been driven by selling our raw materials to China, and now we think we can produce stuff to have independent supply chains from China. It's an absurd proposition to think that we don't need each other.
Yeah, well, that is a kind of an absurd proposition, but it is also real that China's behaviour has become much more aggressive and much more threatening to stability, regional stability over that same period. And so it's not surprising that people are going, well, is this such a great idea? I mean, the fact is that China's ability to dominate processing, everybody else kind of missed the boat a bit, including the US, obviously. So it's a devilish problem, but I do think you would have to be concerned about the fact that China's ability to turn this on and off, less to do with Australia and more to do with its own kind of geopolitical interests and the US and the tension there. And I think you've already seen it because the US has now, under the Biden administration, and heavens knows what's going to happen under the Trump administration, but under the Biden administration, they've just put some more restrictions on semiconductor, aspects of the semiconductor industry and who can do business with Chinese companies. And China has already retaliated with some of their greater bans and restrictions on supplying some of the rare earths like gallium. So it's going to be, it's a very tense period. So you understand the appeal, the intellectual appeal of having alternative supply chains, but the business and commercial aspects as well as the kind of physical aspects are still to be worked out, putting it mildly.
Yeah, I'm concerned that we'll be sitting here 8 years from now and Eneabba will be $5 billion of taxpayer money lit up with zero return.
Yeah,
and we all saw the writing on the wall. That's the concern I have.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very real concern. But I guess then you have to say, all right, well, what's your alternative? You don't put money in, and you just say, well, we just won't do any of this because there's no other way it's going to be commercial.
There's two. I think there's two alternatives. One is focus on massive energy abundance in a lot of ways, like how we're going to have competitive downstream in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
With the status quo. And the other one is special economic zone or integrated industrial parks that have tax concessions which encourage private investment and then allow the private sector to come up with its own investment thesis, model its own returns, and instead of the kind of government saying you're the person that can do this best, but we'll keep tipping up as you have blowouts, which will inevitably happen.
Yes. Well, I think that's right. I mean, Western Australia in particular, has promoting its ability to set up industrial parks and things like that. And you've obviously got Kwinana, and then they've got new ones planned, I think, in the Pilbara. But I mean, I was just driving past Kemerton Industrial Park near Bunbury, and that was decades ago that was set up. You still don't have proper environmental approvals. You don't have land approvals. You don't have proper power. You don't have connections. Like, it's a joke. And I think when Albemarle set up there for its lithium processing plant, that was a kind of pretty big deal, and they were going to expand it. Well, of course, there were two things that have happened. One is that the lithium prices, the collapse in the lithium price. So clearly that's not nearly as attractive as it was. But the other problem has been it's just so difficult to do business down there. It's not as though if you've got choices about where to invest, you choose somewhere that they weren't even at the beginning. And if you compare that to some of the industrial parks in somewhere like Indonesia for nickel, where it's all ready to go, and they do have that kind of shared infrastructure, shared skills, shared work site, everything's there ready to go, and yet we don't manage that at all. And I think that's one of the issues with where the government could have and should have and do something more than it has, but it doesn't want to spend the capital investment on something that's going to be years before there is actually a good return.
With talking about the Pilbara, it fascinates me that the quantity of work that happens up there, and most of it is run on diesel, like the infrastructure up there. I think someone said Rio Tinto chews through 9 billion litres of diesel a year. Like, I don't know if that's for the Pilbara, the iron ore side of things, and everything is freaking huge what they operate. Is there any talk of putting energy infrastructure in at the Pilbara?
Oh no, there's a lot. There's a lot. A lot of them are like Rio and FMG, BHP. They're building solar farms. They're trying, and they've got all these commitments to try and reduce the level of diesel. They're still. I mean, the trucks are obviously a big issue. I mean, because it's just not. The technology's not there for a lot of the trucks to be electric and things, but in terms of the power they're using, there's huge advances being made on that in terms of solar and wind power, putting in their own energy infrastructure.
What about a
There's
gas
no grid.
pipeline
There's
from
no
some?
grid yet, though.
Yeah,
They kind of have their own.
Base load like gas or anything to go up there?
I'm not sure. I think they're more concentrating. There's obviously going to be some gas, but I think they're more concentrating on wind and solar with kind of gas or with backup diesel, whatever.
Yep.
But I think you would be astonished because they're so big and so massive. They can put in those giant projects, whether or not they're going to do them themselves or whether they're going to get a third party to do them. That's all become more complicated. And of course, the other issue is the kind of whole native title thing, and that becomes, if you're taking over much more land, that's also complicated as well. But these things take years basically to develop.
Is there much argy-bargy between them? Because I assume that between the big three and probably chuck Hancock in there as well, it's like, right, who's building it, who's paying for it, who's using it? Because they all want to, you see the bloody dual rail lines up there everywhere because how that whole, the politics with those big iron ore companies works. I assume that'd be the same with the energy.
Well, actually, I think that they've learned a bit of a lesson on that because I remember when there was Rio and BHP and they had their rail lines, and of course Forrest wanted to access those rail lines, and he took them to court and it went for years, and they were saying, well, it just dragged out, but in the end he built his own and common, rather than kind of fighting for common user things. I do think that there's a bit more shared infrastructure on, and they kind of all realise now that they kind of sink or swim together, and you've got quite a bit of cooperation, not necessarily with Fortescue, not necessarily with Hancock, but like Rio and BHP are doing kind of quite a bit of stuff on green iron and how to work together, pilot projects and things like that. So I don't think you're going to find that, because it's too hard, and also it's just the lack of competition, Australia's lack of competitiveness rather, makes that just kind of complicates things further if there's not a degree at least of cooperation.
How is old Twiggy going? You going catching up with him?
No, I haven't caught up with him on this trip.
Has he eaten his humble pie on the hydrogen yet?
I don't think you'd ever see him eating humble pie. No, I don't think so. I think they've just all recognised it's going to take a lot longer than they thought, and that, of course,
And
that's very optimistic.
requires a much higher energy price.
And-
so he's the one beneficiary of a very high energy price.
Yes,
And maybe maybe his import terminal, and all that sort of stuff. It's all kind of like, yeah. I think there's not enough fingers pointing at him for the fact that he's a massive beneficiary of the high energy price by all of
yeah.
this
Well,
sort
of course,
various
Squadron Energy will say, his private owned Squadron Energy will say, actually, the LNG prices are going to be coming down, and we'll be at least competitive with domestic prices, and they'll be going up. I have no idea. As having looked at energy over a period of a decade or so now, the thing that I have become aware of is no, I don't care what expert predictions you've got; they all seem to be wrong, and so you can make some kind of educated guesses, but that's about as far as you get. Now, whether or not the LNG terminal import is going to be a viable proposition, I think it probably will be, only because we've so screwed up our own domestic gas supply.
I've heard word on the decline that Fortescue, or whether it's a subsidiary or whatever, are making some sort of inquiries into nuclear, because it makes the most sense for him to save the world via nuclear as well, as it's just never talked about it. Has there been any, rumours about that going around of their stance towards it, or is it still firm no?
I'm afraid I have not had any conversations about that. So
That'd be breaking news.
yeah, well, you can always have lots of abrupt reversals in any sorts of energy policy. I mean, I've got nothing against nuclear energy. Whether or not it's ever going to be viable in Australia, I don't know. But clearly it answers some of the questions, which is what, of course, the coalition's going on about. It answers some of the questions about being both low emissions or zero emissions virtually, and more reliable. But we're talking 10, 15,
At
20
least.
years out, and I am not sure that we will have any idea of what the energy market looks like at that stage.
So I guess getting back to that point is like this next decade you see is extremely critical.
Well, it's critical, but it's kind of like going in the dark a bit. And Australia has managed, I do think, to stumble. It's been very lucky. It's built its much of its wealth not only on things like iron ore and coal, but also just having low cost energy. And those days are kind of ending. And I don't think anybody's really kind of quite registered that. So the idea, for example, that you've got the government giving subsidies to every household for their power bills, and the coalition not saying whether or not they'd continue that, that's just indicative of a really, really broken system. And it's very, very different to say, like, despite all the problems with the US and mining, at least over there you've got low energy costs.
Do you think Canberra looks enough at Germany, say, on the one hand, and the US on the other hand, and learns from other countries? No.
Answer no.
Firm no.
It's disappointing because it's way cheaper to learn from other people's mistakes than make them yourself.
How real is it, the energy, I guess, crisis and sensitivity over there? Because I know I tune into 2GB every now and then just to make me feel back in New South Wales, and you just hear about how I think it was one of the Hunter Valley plants is on 99% load, and it's literally the AGL plants are teetering on the edge of tripping the whole system out. Is it that runs a fine line all the time?
Yeah, it runs a fine line,
especially in summer, I assume,
all the time.
Yeah,
and also because there was no appreciation. I think there was in the industry, but I don't think there was any political appreciation of how difficult and protracted it would be to get all the transmission lines in place. The days when you can kind of just put all that, just bulldoze through people's property, and that was okay, it was fine, and nobody could say anything. That's gone, and now getting that kind of community support is very, very difficult. And I think we've really not I mean, I don't think the governments have not appreciated that, and so therefore, quite apart from the normal problems with construction costs and lack of labour and all of those, which have only become worse, there's just been zero understanding, which is only just kind of that you actually either have to convince people, pay people, whatever, to allow access. And the governments, of course, haven't really wanted to go to compulsory acquisition because that would make them even more unpopular. So that's a big issue. And then, of course, you've got other hopes like offshore wind power, which I just cannot understand that there would ever be a viable business case for that.
Sounds cool.
Sounds cool.
Looks cool.
Yeah.
Just on hydrogen once more, I think it came out in the budget maybe 6 months ago or so that there were further incentives, minerals processing as well as hydrogen. What was the sort of perspective you had on hydrogen? I think we were sort of scratching our head and thought that hype behind that had been put firmly behind us in the 2020, 2021 kind of period. So I was a bit surprised to see that. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, maybe up to $7 billion in potential, tax credits and the like for hydrogen projects.
Yeah, there were a few billion. I can't remember exactly how many billion, but yeah, that's right. Well, I do think they're trying to, place bets all over the place, and so hydrogen seemed like a good idea, and in the sense that it does take people a while to catch up with reality. The hype kind of carried it because it then takes a while to translate into political reality. So
5 years later,
a few years later, they kind of come up with this in the budget, and this will all be a kind of a great thing. And I'm trying to remember which budget it was, but maybe it was 2 years ago, 18 months ago. Anyway, but it takes for ages, to then come into place.
Cooled on it.
Then the investment market cools on it, but so by the time it becomes actual policy, like you've got that with the production tax credits, for a lot of the critical minerals stuff, When that was kind of being pushed, that seemed like a great idea. Well, now nothing's really much going on in that area, and maybe it will again, but they're not even going to come into effect till 2027. So
yeah,
you spend like a lot of time in the roles that you've had, speaking with like very important, significant decision makers, very like rich people, politicians, blah blah, the whole works, right?
like you.
What are the major frustrations you have, kind of like glancing across that scene? Like if you were
the major frustrations I have, or the major frustrations
you have?
I have.
Yes.
And you impart on the readers.
You mean because I'm a rich person, or because I'm a what? No,
just interacting with a broad spectrum.
Well, I mean, basically, I can see how many frustrations there are in business. And somebody said to me, who will remain unnamed, but fairly significant minor, look, we have a lot of talk about the care economy, and that's all wonderful, and how we need to spend more on that. There's absolutely nothing ever said about productivity or how to increase the wealth so that we can pay for all these services. And look, that's beginning to change a little bit. I mean, but it's very slow. So I guess that is my frustration. And I agree that in the end, it's the private sector that's got to drive things with the kind of right government framework and policies. But it's really only been like almost in the last little tiny while that even the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has kind of basically said, we've really got to do something about the private sector and encourage, private sector investment, and we acknowledge that really it's the private sector that will drive the economy, because that has not been happening. In fact, and so all the jobs not all the jobs, but almost all the jobs that have been created are in government paid jobs. That's where all the focus has been, to kind of, I suppose, compensate for people feeling that they were not getting ahead. So they need more help with, there was that. Well, at the end of the Morrison government, people were, furious that there were problems with aged care, there were problems with childcare, problems with hospitals, things like that. So everybody goes, we just need to put more money into it. But there's been very little focus on how you get to Australia to be a more productive economy to pay for all of that or any of it. And frankly, and the other thing is, of course, the industrial relations laws that the government has put in were really designed because Tony Burke wanted the support of the unions, but there's been no big picture reform attempts, and certainly no real attempts on tax reform. It's all considered too hard, so everything's very incremental.
What do you think some of the ways would be for the economy to be more productive, to answer your frustration?
Well, I do
Just look straight down the camera and tell them, Jenni.
Well, I do think the fact that Australia's tax system is just completely hopeless and is far too reliant, I think, on income tax and taxing, all of those, middle income workers, and at the same time you've got this ageing population. I think that is a huge problem, and nobody wants to take that on. I do think that's a big issue. Similarly with industrial relations, I think all of that has been a problem. And what we've done is relied on immigration to kind of paper a lot of that over. And I do think that there's going to be a reckoning. I mean, Australia, of course, it's a fantastic country to live in. Look at WA, it's always fantastic to be here. Everything looks really healthy. What could go wrong? Well, what could go wrong is we're just kind of sliding. And I don't think we encourage that. But don't even get me started on the education system. So
And we've had this purple patch as well. Like the last, call it like 5 years, the iron ore price has been like 120s, like on average, and yet the Aussie dollar stayed low, and like your 70 cents, 65. So that is an absurd. Normally they track together, right? Like high commodities, your Aussie dollar goes higher.
Coal price too.
Yeah. So the benefit from the royalties of that to the government is like what, like are we used to that as the new sweet spot? Like that's been a purple patch. That's an anomaly. That is not the norm.
yes, but I think everybody does think that's the norm. And of course, let's not forget that everybody outside Western Australia, then gets very resentful about the GST, the money that's going back to Australia, Western Australia.
Money.
Which, I know that nobody outside Western Australia thinks that. I, of course, being a good West Australian, defend this arrangement. But most other people think that's a very, very bad idea. But so I think our kind of whole tax system is just really skewed, and that has not helped. And at the same time, as I said, where most of the jobs have been in the government sector, and the productivity in the public sector just hasn't moved or has gone backwards for decades.
Well, there's been
I know it's hard to measure that, but it's really gotten kind of much, much worse.
Yeah, and there's been a sort of push, or at least more chatter about unionisation in the Pilbara, kind of tying in with the industrial relations, industrial reforms policies. Do you think that goes anywhere, or do you think the realization that it's not bad, we earn an awesome salary, those sorts of things carry Australians sort of through?
Well, I think that's a big risk. I do think that's a risk. And clearly it's going to be a lot easier to, if not organise a workforce, get access and then have complaints, because you really only need one or two people, and you'll be able to enter the site and demand to be part of the bargaining arrangements and things like that. So I think that's a clear risk, but I also think the companies are very aware of that as well, and they're trying to kind of ward that off as much as possible. So if to the extent that it is a problem, this is the beginning, but it'll take some while before you see that particularly evident, I think, in the Pilbara. But, for example, in the coal industry in New South Wales and Queensland, it's much bigger.
And the tunnels and everything in Sydney, like Snowy Hydro, they're all unionised. It's just, I've never worked with one, so I'll probably give a bit of a blasé view, but it just gives people the reason not to work, like unions.
Well, BHP would have the experience in Chile as well, where operations stop. They stop, and I mean, They've always got the coal, and they've got the coal experience in. Yeah, they've got 130 years of fighting unions. So
yes, but also the construction industry in particular, I think, has been
huge,
a particularly bad example of what can go wrong. And in a sense, whether you've had all the the LNG plants in WA or they've been able to get away with it because the conditions have been okay most of the time, but it's really impossible, I think, these days to have a hope of being competitive when you've got that type of level of activity.
Is the tunnels and stuff in Sydney like Snowy Hydro? Is it like does it boost the economy a bit like those infrastructure projects in Sydney, or is it Sydney that big? It's not even that noticeable.
Oh no,
it's the closest thing to mining.
of course,
we've got over there.
Well, of course, it means that there's a lot of money kind of pumping through the economy. That is true. So it does boost it in that way, but it also means that there's a lot of debt building up as well, and money's not going to other parts of the economy.
Yeah. Oh, education system. The University of Wollongong shutting down the mining school. Did you see that?
No, I did not see that.
That was the big uproar. So now there's, I don't know if you're referring to more child or tertiary or both, but there's now only going to be, unless it gets reversed, one mining school on the eastern seaboard of Australia, because UQ had been shut down. I don't think University of Sydney got one, just the one in UNSW. You got the Ballarat one in Melbourne, which is more diplomas. But yeah.
But I think that is an issue that mining has a problem, like an image problem, around the world, I guess. But in a country like Australia, I think it's particularly pronounced. And to your point, I think in WA it's a little different because people do understand. I remember Colin Barnett always used to say to me, every family's always got some connection to the resources industry in WA.
Oh, and you notice it when you go to the airport. When I moved over here, I'm like, far out, there's some high vis floating around.
Yeah,
the whole airport is covered in it. It was just, and coming from eastern states, it's like you'd never seen it.
Yes, and so I think that there's this kind of disconnect between people's understanding of where Australia's wealth comes from, and I mean obviously there's agriculture as well, but this idea that it's somehow just magically produced, in financial circles in Sydney and Melbourne, which of course it's not.
You had this cracking line I'll have to read out in one of your articles a couple months ago. West Australians are hardwired to believe their massive contribution to the national economy is not properly recognised in the eastern states. I love that, and yeah, I mean, I think it really hits home.
It's true.
I don't think I'll find any West Australian will disagree.
Bring on the secession.
What about Big Trumpy? Big Trump's back in power. You've written plenty, and you wrote plenty about himself and Kamala in the lead up. Just go over the whole thing. He's not wasting time.
Can Australia get stuck in the crosshairs? I think is an interesting perspective on the trade wars with Trump.
Yeah, well,
and
I
China.
think it's very possible it could, but when I said that you couldn't predict what was going to happen in the energy market, well, it's even harder to predict what's going to happen in the Trump presidency. And I'm really struck by the fact that markets in general are pretty sanguine about what's going to happen if the impact of a trade war between China and the US, and much higher tariffs and things like that. I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows how that's going to play out. I mean, it was fairly shocking, I think, to both Canada and Mexico when
Canada.
Trump,
Jeez, that's a bit rough.
Exactly when Trump, before he even takes power on June 20, announced, I think it was 25% tariffs on everything coming from Canada and Mexico. Now, you don't know whether he's actually going to proceed with that, or whether he's going to say, yeah, well, if you stop, everybody coming at the border, or if you stop, import of drugs or something, then we'll talk, and it won't happen. It's really difficult to say, but he's got, of course, a Republican Congress now, which, in both the Senate and the House, so that really helps. But with tariffs, he didn't really need that anyway, because you can do a lot just through executive orders and making rules. But what you do know about Trump is that, he's promised everybody that prices will go down. If they start going up, he's going to lose a lot of skin quite quickly. So I think that's why I assume many people in the market think, oh, well, it won't be as bad as predicted, because even though he's promising radical change, and much more manufacturing in the US, he's not going to wait for prices to really become, inflation in that sense to really become a big problem for him politically. Now, how you can calibrate all that and manage it, I've no idea, and
Well,
I'm not sure he does either.
He must be. He must really want to. Because what did he say? He wants to get the income tax rate down to 15% or 13.5%.
Well, I think he wants.
They have federal and state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he also wants the business. He'll certainly cut corporate tax rate quite a lot.
I think that was it was the corporate one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because he might if he's going to put tariffs on everything, but get prices down, it has to come from tax. You would think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, nobody in the US, whether it used to be the Republicans, really cared about debt. Well, nobody does. The Republicans are
Might have to pay a bit off, he reckons.
Yeah, so that's
See
a
if
kind of
Elon can fix that one.
yeah. Well, it's all about the economic growth will just magically take care of all this, so it won't be an issue.
Run away from it.
Yeah.
What and so what's the view out there with as just sort of JD was saying about it, the effect on Australia if the tariffs are being imposed on China, is it going to maybe promote less growth in China, which is going to pretty much impact everything we export to China and the amount of it?
Well,
What's the
it could.
view?
I mean, what's interesting is that the Chinese government, just in the last week or so, has said much more about, they're prepared to have a much looser monetary policy and much kind of greater physical stimulus, but they've held out entirely on saying what that is.
Yep.
And I think they're just waiting to see how the Trump administration policies affect them. But clearly, I mean, the Chinese economy's obviously been a lot weaker, and the consumer demand has been weaker than the government might have hoped. They've been managing to get away with that, but they won't want it to get much worse. And so therefore, I think they will unleash a stimulus. So in that sense, yes, Australia would be caught, and clearly, as a major export, if there's a trade war going on which has a problem for the global economy, then that is difficult for Australia, and you'd naturally be kind of caught by that. But I think it's also true that China is well prepared to act to kind of try and stimulate its economy. But whether or not that's more through kind of consumer demand than anything, I don't know. But it's just going to be a very tense year or two, I'd say.
Mm. And military is the interesting one. I was seeing that, the federal government's putting $600 million in to get a rugby league team in PNG, which is pretty much a lot of money they're paying to get a big defence base over there.
Yes.
Effectively.
Yes. Well,
which is all related to,
yes.
China, Taiwan.
Well, that's right. But of course, the thing is, it's very hard to outcompete China with money.
Yeah.
So therefore, you have to kind of try and outcompete in other ways, including cultural ties and job offers and things like that. And there's no doubt that the Australian government was left completely unaware and napping when the Solomon Islands signed I think, a treaty or a pact or a security pact with China. So they're determined, and of course the Americans are particularly determined, that not happen again. So I think you'll see kind of quite a bit more of this emphasis. But there's no doubt that China's, behaving kind of much more, it's much more active, it's becoming more aggressive. I mean, I saw somebody from the Philippines the other day is in charge of the Navy in the Philippines. And, you can see what China's doing there against the Philippines. The Philippines have been cautious in how they respond. Again, they're waiting to see what the Trump administration policies are going to be.
Is Australia going to be good buddies with Trump? Do you think if we're going to de-China, America's going to fill the void for Australia or not?
Well, it can't. I mean, in a sense,
it's a long way away.
Well, no, I don't think there's any doubt that there'll be a very strong alliance remaining with the US. I don't think that's going to change. I do think some of Trump's policies, as you know, there's already a large section of the Labor left that doesn't like AUKUS and the submarines and thinks that all of that's a bad idea, quite apart from the practical problems. So I think that will strengthen that. But I don't think there's any doubt that Australia will still be heavily reliant on the US for defence purposes, not least because we don't spend anything ourselves. We're actually going to be more integrated than ever with the US. and the submarines are just one small part of that.
Yeah.
You've also got the, away from military, the Inflation Reduction Act, which we were talking about nonstop last year, but it's gone quite quiet on that front. Do you have a view on whether Trump strips that right back or whether there's actually any material benefits for more than a couple Aussie companies to be had on that front?
That's right, because it's not as if there's been a lot of American investment or European investment or anything kind of like to take the place of China, which is one of, the issues. It's all very well for them to say we want all these alternative supply chains. Well, where's the money? But in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, again, who would know? But one of the things that I think there'll be obviously more of an emphasis on oil and gas, but even under the Biden administration, American oil production and gas production was at its highest level ever. So there's a kind of quite a lot of hot air, really, talked about all this. And the other issue with the Inflation Reduction Act is that it was basically a lot of government money going out to a lot of different projects, including manufacturing projects, including in heavily Republican states. So it would not be likely, I don't think, that either Congress or Trump would be particularly interested in pulling those types of projects. Now, maybe there'll be some, marginal wind project or something like that in, California that wouldn't get support in the same way that might have. But all these things are very, very difficult to untangle.
Does the tariffs and the Inflation Reduction Act go hand in hand at all? Like if he's going to up the tariffs, is that going to make it give people more incentive to build and purchase in America, meaning they don't need the IRA as much?
Oh, well, I'm sure that, as we know, everybody always likes government money, and once it's kind of given, it's very hard to not, or tax incentives and things. But it kind of goes hand in hand, but with the idea of restoring a lot of American manufacturing. For the reasons we've talked about, America has more prospect of doing that than Australia does, in part because of its lower energy costs and greater efficiency overall. Yep. But it doesn't seem also realistic that you're going to be able to replace, a lot of low-cost Chinese goods with.
No. Need another communist country. You can't get as cheap as them.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting angle on the on the trade wars. It's not just one and two. Things move. You take the iPhone factory out of China, it goes to Vietnam or something like that.
Exactly, and that's what's been happening. So it depends how strict they want to be about interpreting all of that. And I don't think there'd obviously be some people who would, and Trump has been consistent. One thing he has been consistent about is, a belief in tariffs for decades. But I'm not sure that many people would say they'll definitely be, they'll say, well, if it comes from Vietnam, it's got made any Chinese parts, unless it's sensitive, we won't be able to import any of that, because I think the impact on the American economy and prices would be a bit too much.
Vietnam's cheaper than China, isn't it? It's lower cost labour
that's
than
one
China.
One of the reasons that a lot of it was
also
moving
a
anyway.
communist country. But that's another topic.
Oh, that'll be 30 years down the road. They'll be like, we've got to de-Vietnam. Bloody good soup, but I love the soup. Right, get the crystal ball out, Jenny, for the next decade. You said this is a critical decade coming up with energy and just a bit of everything. What do you think's going to play out?
Well, I think
federal election's probably the first place to start.
Federal election.
Because we're going to use this against you in future if you get it all wrong. Just letting you know.
Which is why I'm going to sound extremely cautious in what I say. But at the moment, obviously, it looks most likely that that the Labor Party will not be able to form majority government. But the question is, how close they can get. For the Liberals to pick up, say, something like 20 seats, that doesn't seem particularly feasible unless there's an absolute, revulsion against them. But I don't think they're going to be enough. But I think we're going to actually have a bit of, sorry to sound so negative at Christmas, but a bit of paralysis, because you're either going to have the Labor Party in a much weakened position, or I think far less likely, but possible, you had a coalition government. Well, guess what? They're just going to be stymied in the Senate. Yeah. I do think this kind of paralysis. But paralysis in Australian politics it's a really big issue, and I do think the Senate is it's just we're where policies go to die. Now, that can be good if they're bad policies, but not good if they're good policies. And it certainly doesn't encourage the type of, restructuring or kind of quite hard policy choices that I think would be needed to kind of change the kind of meandering direction of the Australian economy at the moment.
Is that, and is one of those around like tax legislation? Is that one of the big ones?
That'd be a huge one.
That's your Jenny's big ticket item, I can sense.
Yeah. And so then, of course, then the other issue is, and everybody hopes that this is not the case, and presumably it'll be all right. But I mean, it is not incorrect to say that the world looks just a lot more dangerous than it did, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and it is. And I'm not there'll be a black swan event. Nobody knows exactly where it'll come from.
Well, I think Taiwan's probably the top of the probabilities, I'd say.
Well, I guess it is, and we'll just see how that works. But I mean, what the Biden administration was always doing, not necessarily always effectively, but it was building up a lot more alliances, in the region. They put a lot of focus on that with Japan, India, whether they called it the lattice work, I think, of alliances, which is a kind of fancy name, but whether or not that will continue, how much more dramatic, I don't know. But I do think that it's going to be a very interesting in not necessarily the good sense of the word period over the next few years. And my issue, I guess, in terms of Australian concerns is that the politics of that, the government's and public understanding of that is not really there. And so nobody wants to talk about, other than the fact we can kind of just continue what we're doing, really.
There you go. So you're not held to much there.
No.
There's no specific thing. So, you've been, ain't your first rodeo, Jenny. Anything else, boys?
I'm all out. Thanks a lot for making the time.
Pleasure.
It's heaps better. I have much more intelligent conversations with you when I've got other people with me to assist.
And I wonder why that is.
Thanks very much, Ian. Merry Christmas to yourself. And you may not be the last AFR person that comes on before the end of the year.
Oh, well, I hope
Got to
not.
get the two gingers on.
Yes,
back on.
good.
So,
Fantastic.
Okay.
yes,
Thanks a
right.
lot.
Thank
All
you
right.
very much.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, beauty. That was bloody sensational. Thanks to the... I don't even know if the AFR knew she was coming on, but she got clearance.
Say no now.
But when you're a big deal like
She
Jenny
runs it.
Hewett, you just do whatever the fuck you want.
That's
it's
it.
all good. That's all. I hope to be at that stage one day in life.
We do have a couple of people to thank, though.
Mate,
In the interim?
these people do what you want.
That's
They
it.
are a service provider, mineral mining services.
Grounded.
Oh, grounded. Sandvik ground support.
CRE Insurance.
K-Drill.
Daysat.
Saltbush Contracting.
And Get Wet Solutions.
Oh, mate, I can't wait to get wet at Christmas.
Hooteroo.
The information contained in this episode of Money of Mine is of general nature only and does not take into account the objectives, financial situation or needs of any particular person. Before making any investment decision, you should consult with your financial advisor and consider how appropriate the advice is to your objectives, financial situation and needs.